The sword had stood in the churchyard stone through the darkest weeks of winter. Every great lord in Britain had tried it. Dukes had set their boots against the anvil and hauled until their arms shook. Earls had wrapped their hands in leather and pulled until the crowd stopped believing anything would happen. The steel never moved, not an inch, not a tremor. It sat locked in the stone as if the stone and the sword had always been one piece of the same rock, waiting for a hand that had not yet arrived. On this New Year's morning, the hand that arrived belonged to no one important. A boy sent on an errand, looking only for a sword to borrow because his foster brother had forgotten his own at the inn. He saw the blade catching the winter light. He did not know what it meant. He did not know whose sword it was, or what waited on the other side of pulling it free. He closed his hand around the hilt anyway. Welcome to Aeonkeep, where the ancient legends live. Today, the legend of a blacksmith's ward who pulled a sword from a stone that no lord in Britain could move and became a king no one had chosen. The sword in the stone does not come from ancient Britain in the way the Titanomachy comes from ancient Greece. There is no Bronze Age hearth tale here, no oral epic reaching back to the fall of Troy. This story belongs to a specific, traceable moment. The flowering of French and English Romance literature in the 12th and 13th centuries, when poets working in royal and noble courts took the older, half-historical figure of Arthur, a shadowy war leader first given full literary shape by Geoffrey of Monmouth around 1136, and rebuilt him as something closer to a Christian romance hero. It was in this world, not in the mists of the 5th century, that the sword in the stone was born. A story written for audiences steeped in chivalric ideals, where kingship needed to be proven not by conquest or bloodline alone, but by divine sign. The tale would be retold, reshaped, and expanded across 2.5 centuries of manuscripts, French and English, verse and prose, until an English knight named Sir Thomas Malory gathered the sprawling tradition into a single vast book in the late 15th century, the version most of the world would come to know. Uther Pendragon was dead, and Britain had no king. He had reigned hard and left little behind him, no clear heir the barons could point to, no settled line of succession, only rumour of an infant son sent away at birth under circumstances nobody spoke of plainly. Without a king, the great lords of the realm did what great lords always do in the absence of one. They eyed each other's lands, and they began, quietly, to imagine themselves on the throne. The sorcerer Merlin, who had shaped much of this kingdom from the shadows already, went to the Archbishop of Canterbury with counsel of his own. "Summon every lord and every man of arms in the realm to London by Christmas," he said. "Let them gather and pray together, and let God, on the night of his own son's birth, show Britain who its rightful king should be." The Archbishop, acting on that counsel, sent out the summons. It was, on its surface, an act of piety. It was also, more practically, the only tool left to keep the kingdom from tearing itself apart. On the morning after that first service, the churchyard held something that had not been there the evening before. A great square stone had appeared before the high altar, and standing up out of the stone was an anvil of steel, and driven down through the anvil into the stone itself was a sword, its blade sunk deep, its hilt catching the light, gold lettering wrapped around the pommel. The letters spelled out a promise as much as a fact. Whoever pulls this sword from this stone and anvil is rightwise king, born of all England. No one had seen it placed. No mason had laid the stone. No smith in London claimed the sword as his work. It had arrived in the dark, as if the city itself had grown it. The archbishop understood at once what this was, or at least suspected. He set a guard of 10 knights around the stone, day and night, and sent word to every lord in the land. Come to London, try the sword, and let God settle by strength and grace what argument could not settle by itself. On New Year's Day, after Mass, the greatest men of Britain filed out into the churchyard one after another to make their attempt. They failed, every one of them. Some pulled with both hands and their full weight thrown backward, red-faced, jaws clenched, until they staggered back empty-handed. Some barely touched the hilt before stepping away, unwilling to be seen failing in front of their rivals. The sword did not so much as shift in its stone. By the time the last lord had tried and failed, the churchyard was full of men who had learned, publicly and humiliatingly, that they were not the answer to the question the stone was asking. The archbishop declared a tournament instead, a joust to be held on the same day, so that the lords who had travelled so far would not leave with nothing to show for the journey, and so that the sword could remain in the churchyard a while longer, waiting for whoever it was truly meant for. Among the knights who rode to that tournament was a young man named Sir Kay, newly knighted that same winter, eager to prove himself in his first great contest. He brought with him his foster brother, a boy younger than Kay, unknighted, whose place at the tournament was only to serve, to carry Kay's gear, to see to his horse, to make sure nothing was forgotten before his brother rode out to fight. This boy had grown up in Kay's household, raised alongside him since infancy by Kay's father, Sir Ector, though whose son he actually was, no one in that household had ever been told. He was Kay's brother in every way that mattered, and no one's son in any way that could be proven. His name was Arthur. On the morning of the joust, disaster struck in the smallest, most ordinary way disasters strike. Kay reached for his sword and found the sheath at his side empty. He had left the blade behind at their lodgings, forgotten in the rush of the morning. He sent Arthur back to fetch it, urgently, because a knight without a sword could not enter the lists, and the tournament was already gathering. Arthur rode back to the inn and found the doors locked. Everyone inside had already gone to watch the joust. No amount of knocking brought anyone to let him in, and Arthur, young, practical, unwilling to return to his brother empty-handed and cost him his place in the tournament, thought of another sword he had seen not far away, the one in the churchyard, the one guarded, supposedly, though when he arrived at the churchyard itself, he found it standing empty. The knights assigned to watch it had gone to the tournament too, drawn away by the same joust that had emptied the inn. Arthur did not know what the sword meant. He had not been at the Christmas service where the letters on the pommel were first read aloud. He saw only a sword, unguarded, in a stone that made a strange kind of pedestal, and a brother waiting who badly needed a blade. He climbed up, set both hands to the hilt, and pulled. It came free at once. No resistance, no strain, as easily as drawing a sword from a scabbard built to fit it. Arthur did not linger to wonder at that. He carried it straight back to Kay, who took one look at the golden hilt and the letters wrapped around the pommel, and understood immediately what his young brother had just done. Kay, to his credit, or perhaps to his shame, tried first to claim the achievement for himself. He rode straight to his father, Sir Ector, sword in hand, and announced that he had drawn the sword from the stone, that he, Kay, must therefore be king. Ector was not a fool, and not easily impressed by his son's sudden claim to the throne of Britain. He led both boys back to the churchyard, made Kay swear on a holy relic to say exactly how he had come by the sword, and Kay, under that oath in front of the stone itself, broke and admitted the truth. Arthur had brought it to him. Arthur had drawn it. Ector turned to Arthur and asked him to put the sword back into the stone and try it again, this time in front of witnesses who would actually see what happened. Arthur set the blade back into the anvil. Kay tried first, straining with everything he had, and could not move it. Ector himself tried, and failed the same way every lord before him had failed. Then Arthur reached out, closed his hand around the hilt, and drew the sword free as easily as the first time, smoothly, without effort, as though the stone had been waiting all along to let it go. Ector went down on one knee in front of him. Arthur, confused and a little frightened, asked his own foster father why he was kneeling. And that was the moment Ector finally told him the truth he had kept for years. That Arthur was not his son by blood, that he had been given the boy in infancy by a figure with his own reasons for keeping the child's true parentage hidden, and that whatever the boy's birth truly was, the sword in the stone had just answered a question no one had thought to ask him directly. The barons of Britain did not accept this quietly. A boy, unknighted, unknown, raised in an ordinary household with no proof of noble blood beyond a foster father's word, could not be handed a kingdom on the strength of one freed sword alone. They demanded the test be repeated, and repeated again at Candlemas, and then at Easter, and then at Pentecost, each time gathering more lords, each time giving every man of rank a fresh chance to succeed where he had already failed. Each time, only Arthur's hand moved the blade. By Pentecost, even the most stubborn among the barons could no longer argue with what they had watched happen 4 times over. The commons of London, who had gathered to watch each trial, settled the matter emotionally before the lords settled it politically, crying out that they would have Arthur for their king and would slay any man who stood against it. Faced with the will of the people and the plain evidence of the stone, the barons yielded. Arthur was made king, sword in hand, before the high altar where the stone had first appeared. The sword in the stone is entirely absent from the earliest layer of Arthurian material, the Welsh tales, Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century Historia Regum Britannia, and the chronicles that followed it. Geoffrey gives Arthur a famous sword, which he calls Caliburnus, the ancestor of the name Excalibur, but Arthur carries it into battle without any test attached to it. There is no stone, no anvil, no proof of kingship required. The motif first appears roughly half a century later in the French poet Robert de Boron's verse romance Merlin, written around 1200. In de Boron's version, and in the prose retellings and Vulgate cycle manuscripts that followed it through the 13th century, the sword drawn from the stone and the sword called Excalibur are one and the same weapon. The fullest and most widely known version of the story, the one this episode has followed, comes from Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, printed in 1485. Malory drew on the earlier French Romance tradition, but made one significant change. In his account, the sword in the stone is a separate weapon from Excalibur. Arthur later breaks this first sword in single combat, and receives Excalibur afterward from the Lady of the Lake, a detail many modern retellings collapse back into a single sword, blending Malory's version with de Boron's. Malory is also the source for the specific narrative beats this episode relies on most heavily: Merlin's counsel to the Archbishop, Kay's forgotten sword, Arthur's search for a replacement, the repeated trials at successive feasts, and the crowd's decisive intervention at Pentecost. Where a detail in this telling cannot be traced to Malory or the earlier French tradition, it has been omitted rather than invented. It is worth stating plainly what the sources do not offer: reliable evidence that any of this happened. No archaeological find, no contemporary chronicle, no Roman or sub-Roman British record describes a stone, a sword, or a coronation resembling this story. Whether a historical war leader named Arthur existed at all in 5th or 6th century Britain remains genuinely unresolved among historians, and even those who argue he did exist generally agree the sword in the stone belongs to literature, not to history, a symbol added centuries later to answer a question monarchy has always needed answering. What makes one person's claim to rule more legitimate than another's? Strip away the magic, and the story asks a question every hereditary system eventually has to face. What actually makes a ruler legitimate? Not strength, since every strong lord in the churchyard failed. Not ambition, since ambition drove every one of them to try. The sword answers to something the story never quite names. Not bloodline alone, since Arthur doesn't know his own blood when he pulls it free, and not merit exactly, since he isn't trying to prove anything when he reaches for the hilt. He needed a sword, and the sword was there, and it yielded to his hand. The story leaves open whether that makes him chosen or only fortunate in an age willing to call fortune a sign from God. If you want to go deeper into the ancient world, Aeonkeep Mythology ebooks explore these ancient myths in full, the stories, the gods, and the worlds that shaped them. You'll find the link in the description. This legend has been told. Subscribe and return to Aeonkeep. More legends await.